The morning rain drummed against the windows of Corner Brew, a small coffee shop tucked between a used bookstore and a flower shop on Maple Street. Sarah Williams pulled her worn baseball cap lower over her eyes and adjusted the oversized hoodie. That had become her uniform for the past 3 months. The faded jeans and scuffed sneakers completed the disguise that had become her second skin, a far cry from the designer suits and polished heels that once defined her public image. She approached the counter with the same careful steps she'd practiced every morning, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact. The barista, a college-aged girl with bright purple hair, smiled warmly despite the early hour. "Good morning. What can I get you today?" "Just a medium coffee, black, please," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of conversation and the espresso machine's rhythmic steaming. "That'll be $4.50. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn debit card, the one connected to the small account she'd set up under an assumed name. She slid it across the counter and waited, her heart performing the same anxious dance it did every morning. Living on a deliberately limited budget was part of her elaborate plan to disappear from the world that had consumed her for 15 years. The card reader beeped, and the barista's expression shifted slightly. "I'm sorry, but your card was declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Heat rushed to Sarah's cheeks as the familiar panic of her new reality set in. She'd been so careful with her spending, calculating every purchase down to the penny. Let me check my wallet," she stammered, knowing full well that she had exactly $2.37 in crumpled bills. The line behind her began to grow restless. She could feel their impatience pressing against her back like a physical weight. A businessman checked his watch with exaggerated annoyance, and a woman in yoga clothes tapped her foot rhythmically on the tile floor. "I'll cover it." The voice came from directly behind her, warm and gentle, cutting through her embarrassment like sunlight through storm clouds. Sarah turned to see a man in his early 30s, wearing a simple navy sweater over dark jeans. His brown hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his green eyes held a kindness that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You don't have to do that," Sarah protested, her voice catching slightly. "I know I don't have to," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "But I want to. We've all been there." He stepped forward and handed his card to the barista. "Make it 2 medium coffees, both black." As the barista processed the payment, Sarah found herself studying this stranger who had stepped into her moment of humiliation with such casual grace. There was something about him that felt steady and real, qualities that had become precious to her in a world where she'd learned to question everyone's motives. "Thank you," she whispered as they moved aside to wait for their drinks. "You really didn't need to. I'm Marcus," he said, extending his hand. "And you look like you're having the kind of morning that a good cup of coffee might help." "Sarah," she replied, accepting his handshake and feeling the calluses on his fingers, the kind that came from real work with his hands. "And you're right about the morning." Their drinks arrived, and Marcus gestured toward a small table by the window. "Would you like to sit for a minute? You look like you could use a friendly face." Every instinct Sarah had developed over the past months screamed at her to decline, to maintain the careful distance she'd cultivated from everyone and everything. But something about Marcus felt different, genuine in a way that had become rare in her experience. Against her better judgment, she nodded. They settled into the worn wooden chairs, and Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass, creating a cocoon of intimacy around their small table. "So what do you do?" Marcus asked, taking a sip of his coffee and studying her with curious but respectful eyes. The question she'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. "I'm between jobs right now," she said, which was technically true, though the gap between her old life and whatever came next felt more like a chasm than a pause. "What about you?" "I'm a social worker," Marcus replied, and something in his tone suggested he genuinely loved what he did. I work with kids in the foster system, helping them find permanent placements and adjust to new families. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was a man who spent his days helping others rebuild their lives, and he'd unknowingly extended that same compassion to someone who was desperately trying to rebuild her own existence from the ground up. That must be rewarding work, she said, and meant it. It is, though it can be heartbreaking too. You see a lot of kids who've been let down by the adults in their lives, and sometimes the system meant to protect them. His eyes grew distant for a moment. But when you help a child find their forever family or watch them overcome something difficult, those moments make everything worthwhile. Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn in by his passion and authenticity. When was the last time someone had spoken to her about their work with such genuine care, without calculating what they might gain from the conversation? You must see a lot of different situations, she said. Every case is unique, but there are common threads. Kids who've been abandoned, who've learned not to trust adults, who think they're not worthy of love. Marcus paused, studying her face, with an intensity that made her wonder what he was seeing. Sometimes adults carry those same wounds. The feeling that they have to prove their worth, that love is conditional, that they're only valuable for what they can provide rather than who they are. His words hit her like a physical blow, accurate and devastating in their precision. Sarah set down her coffee cup with trembling hands, wondering how this stranger had managed to see through all her carefully constructed walls in the space of a single conversation. 3 months ago, Sarah Williams had been one of the most powerful women in the country. As CEO of Meridian Industries, a Fortune 500 company she'd built from a small family business into a multi-billion-dollar empire. She'd been featured on magazine covers, invited to speak at conferences, and courted by politicians and celebrities alike. Her days had been filled with board meetings, strategic decisions, and the constant pressure of maintaining the growth that Wall Street demanded. But with success had come isolation. Every relationship in her life had become transactional. Friends who called only when they needed something. Romantic partners who seemed more interested in her net worth than her heart. Family members who saw her as a solution to their financial problems, rather than a person who might need support herself. The breaking point had come on a Tuesday morning in her corner office on the 42nd floor. She'd been reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant buzzed in to let her know that her sister had called, asking for another loan to cover her mortgage. It was the third time in 6 months, and as Sarah hung up the phone, she realized she couldn't remember the last time anyone in her family had called just to see how she was doing. That evening, she'd stood in her penthouse apartment, surrounded by expensive furniture and priceless art, and felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The empire she'd built had become a prison, and everyone in her life saw her as nothing more than a source of money and opportunity. So she'd done something that shocked even herself. She'd stepped down as CEO, citing health concerns, and arranged for her most trusted lieutenant to take over operations. She'd moved most of her wealth into trust funds and anonymous accounts, keeping only enough to live modestly. Then she'd disappeared, renting a small apartment across town under an assumed name and beginning the process of discovering who Sarah Williams might be when stripped of her wealth and power. The first 2 months had been brutal. Without the constant demands of running a company, she'd been forced to confront the emptiness of her personal life. But slowly she'd begun to find small pleasures in simple things. The way morning light fell across her tiny kitchen table, the satisfaction of cooking her own meals, the peace of walking through the neighborhood without bodyguards or a constantly ringing phone. Now, sitting across from Marcus in this humble coffee shop, she realized she'd been testing whether anyone could value her for herself alone. His kindness to a stranger whose card had been declined suggested that such people still existed in the world. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked gently, and Sarah realized she'd been lost in thought for several minutes. "Sorry, I was just thinking about what you said, about adults carrying wounds from childhood. It's something I see a lot in my work, but also in my own life," Marcus admitted. "I grew up in foster care myself, Bounced around from family to family until I aged out of the system at 80. Sarah's heart clenched at his casual admission of such a difficult past. That must have been incredibly hard. It was, but it also taught me resilience and showed me the importance of human connection. The families who made the biggest difference weren't necessarily the ones with the most money or the nicest houses. They were the ones who saw me as a person worth loving, not just another placement to manage. His words resonated with her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Here was someone who understood what it meant to feel disposable, to wonder if you were worthy of love for who you were rather than what you could provide. I should probably get going, Sarah said reluctantly, glancing at the clock on the wall. She had nowhere to be, but the intensity of their conversation was both exhilarating and terrifying. Of course, Marcus said, standing as she did. I hope your day gets better from here. As they walked toward the door together, Sarah found herself wanting to extend their time together, to hold on to this unexpected connection just a little longer. Thank you again for the coffee, she said, as they stepped outside into the cool morning air. It was my pleasure, Marcus replied, and then with a slight hesitation added, I don't usually do this, but would you maybe like to get coffee again sometime? When your card isn't giving you trouble? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and risk. Sarah's first instinct was to say no, to maintain the careful boundaries she'd established. But looking into Marcus's hopeful eyes, she found herself nodding. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. They exchanged phone numbers, and as Sarah watched Marcus walk away down the rain-slicked sidewalk, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The flutter of genuine anticipation for human connection. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Marcus began meeting regularly at Corner Brew. What started as casual coffee dates evolved into long conversations that ranged from childhood memories to philosophical discussions about the meaning of success and happiness. Marcus shared stories from his work describing the challenges and victories of helping children find stability and love. Sarah, still maintaining her careful disguise, spoke about her past in vague terms, describing a career in business that had left her feeling burned out and empty. With each meeting, Sarah found herself falling for Marcus in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or status. She loved the way his eyes lit up when he talked about successfully placing a child with a loving family. She admired his patience with difficult cases and his refusal to give up on kids that others might write off as lost causes. Most of all, she treasured the way he listened to her, really listened, as if her thoughts and feelings mattered independent of any benefit he might gain from their relationship. But alongside her growing feelings came increasing guilt about the deception she was maintaining. Marcus was sharing his authentic self with her while she was living a lie. Every time he insisted on paying for their coffee or suggested they go somewhere that required money she claimed not to have, she felt the weight of her dishonesty. The crisis came on a Friday evening when Marcus invited her to dinner at a small Italian restaurant. As they sat across from each other in the dim candlelight, sharing a plate of pasta and talking about their dreams for the future, Sarah realized she was in love with him. But she also knew that their relationship was built on a foundation of lies that would eventually crumble. Sarah, Marcus said, reaching across the table to take her hand, there's something I need to tell you. Her heart stopped, wondering if he'd somehow discovered her true identity. I know things have been tough for you financially, he continued gently. And I want you to know that it doesn't matter to me at all. I care about you, about who you are as a person. If you need help finding work, or if you need someone to talk to about whatever you're going through, I'm here. The kindness in his voice was almost unbearable. Here was this man, offering support and understanding to someone he believed was struggling, asking nothing in return except the chance to care for her. The contrast with every other relationship in her previous life was stark and heartbreaking. Marcus, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, what if I told you that everything you think you know about me is wrong? He squeezed her hand gently. Then I'd say that people have complicated reasons for protecting themselves, and I'd wait until you felt safe enough to share the real story. That night, Sarah lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with the impossible choice before her. She could continue living this lie, enjoying the pure connection she'd found with Marcus while denying him the truth about who she really was. Or she could reveal everything and risk losing the first genuine relationship she'd had in years. The decision came the next morning when she opened her laptop and saw the news headlines. Meridian Industries stock had plummeted after a failed product launch and several key executives had resigned. The company she'd spent 15 years building was in crisis, and the board was desperately trying to convince her to return as CEO. Sarah stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility and the weight of hundreds of jobs hanging in the balance. But she also thought about Marcus, about the man who had shown her what it meant to be valued for herself rather than her accomplishments. She closed the laptop and picked up her phone, typing a text message to Marcus with trembling fingers. "Can we meet at Corner Brew this afternoon? There's something important I need to tell you." That afternoon, Sarah sat in their usual spot by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. When Marcus arrived, she could see the concern in his eyes as he took in her pale complexion and tense posture. "What's wrong?" he asked, sliding into the chair across from her. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the future of their relationship. "My name is Sarah Williams," she began, "and 3 months ago I was the CEO of Meridian Industries." Marcus's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "The Fortune 500 company? But I thought you said you were between jobs." "I lied," Sarah said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I lied about everything. I'm not broke. I'm not struggling to find work. I'm worth more money than most people see in a lifetime, and I walked away from it all because I was so tired of never knowing if people cared about me or just what I could do for them." She watched Marcus's face carefully, searching for signs of anger or betrayal, but his expression remained carefully neutral as he processed her revelation. "That morning when my card was declined," she continued, "it was because I'd deliberately limited myself to a small account as part of trying to live anonymously. I wanted to see if anyone could care about me when I had nothing to offer except myself." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and emotions. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quiet and measured. "So when I bought you coffee that morning, you were testing me?" "No," Sarah said quickly, then caught herself. "Maybe, I don't know. At first, maybe I was curious about your motives. But Marcus, what happened between us, what we've built together? It's the most real thing I've experienced in years." Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in the gesture she'd come to love. "I need to understand something. All these weeks, when I was worried about you struggling financially, when I insisted on paying for things because I thought you couldn't afford them, you were letting me do that while sitting on a fortune." The hurt in his voice was like a knife to her heart. "I know how it looks, and I know I handled it terribly. But Marcus, you have to understand, every relationship in my previous life was about money. People wanted things from me, expected me to solve their problems, saw me as a walking ATM. When you bought me that coffee, when you cared about a stranger who couldn't pay for a $4 drink, it was the first genuine kindness I'd experienced in so long. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." "I was afraid," Sarah admitted, tears beginning to blur her vision. "I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd change. That you'd start seeing dollar signs instead of me. That you'd want me to fix problems or fund your work or become someone I didn't want to be anymore." Marcus sat quietly for a long moment, his green eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but serious. "Sarah, I work with kids who've been lied to and manipulated by adults their entire lives. I know what deception looks like, and I know how much damage it can cause. What hurts me isn't that you have money. It's that you didn't trust me enough to be honest about who you are." "I know," Sarah whispered. "And I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry. Why are you telling me now?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the news articles about Meridian Industries. "Because my company is falling apart and they want me to come back. Because I have to decide what kind of life I want to live, and I realized I couldn't make that decision while lying to the person I care about most." Marcus read the headlines, his eyebrows rising as he took in the scale of the crisis. This is really your company? You built this? From the ground up? My father started it as a small manufacturing business, and after he died, I grew it into what you see now. For 15 years, it was my whole life. And you walked away from all of that to work in a coffee shop and pretend to be broke? I walked away because I was drowning, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. I was so lonely, Marcus. So tired of being seen as a solution to everyone else's problems instead of a person who might have problems of her own. She watched as understanding began to dawn in his eyes, the anger slowly giving way to something that might have been compassion. When you helped me that morning, when you sat with me and shared your coffee and your story, it was the first time in years that someone had treated me like I was worth caring about just because I was human. Not because I was successful or powerful or useful, but just because I was a person having a hard moment. Marcus was quiet for a long time, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the table. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I need some time to think about this, he said gently. This is a lot to process, and I need to figure out how I feel about everything you've told me. Sarah nodded, her heart sinking but understanding his need for space. Of course. I know I don't have any right to ask, but please know that every moment we've shared, every conversation we've had, that was all real. The feelings I have for you, they have nothing to do with money or status or any of the things that complicate it. My whole life? Marcus stood up, pausing beside her chair. For what it's worth, Sarah, I believe that what you felt was real. I just need to figure out if what I felt was based on knowing the real you or the version of you that you created for me to know. After he left, Sarah sat alone at their table for another hour, watching the rain streak down the windows and wondering if she'd just destroyed the best thing to happen to her in years. That evening, she returned to her small apartment and pulled out her laptop, staring at the urgent emails from her board of directors and the increasingly desperate pleas for her to return and save the company she'd built. For 3 days, Sarah heard nothing from Marcus. She maintained her routine, visiting Corner Brew each morning and hoping to see him there, but their table by the window remained empty. The silence gave her time to think about the choices ahead of her and what she truly wanted her life to look like. On the third evening, as she was preparing a simple dinner in her tiny kitchen, her phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and her heart hammered as she answered. Hi, she said softly. Hi, I've been thinking about what you told me and I'd like to talk. Are you free tonight? Yes, of course. There's a park about 2 blocks from Corner Brew on Oak Street. Can you meet me there in an hour? Sarah arrived at the small neighborhood park as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She found Marcus sitting on a bench beside a small pond, watching ducks paddle lazily across the water. He looked up as she approached, and she was relieved to see that the anger had faded from his eyes, replaced by something that looked like cautious hope. Thank you for meeting me, she said, settling beside him on the bench but maintaining careful distance. I've been thinking about everything you told me, Marcus began, his gaze focused on the water. At first I was angry about the deception, but then I started thinking about the kids I work with, the ones who've learned to hide parts of themselves because they've been hurt or rejected when they showed who they really were. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes but didn't speak, afraid to interrupt. I realized that what you did, creating a false identity to see if anyone could care about the real you, it's not that different from what some of my kids do. They test the adults in their lives, pushing boundaries and hiding their true selves to see if love is conditional. I never thought about it that way, Sarah whispered. Marcus turned to look at her directly. The morning I bought you coffee, I didn't do it because I thought you were poor or because I wanted something from you. I did it because I saw someone having a difficult moment, and I remembered what it felt like to be in that position with no one to help. I know that now. I think I knew it then too. The woman I've gotten to know over these past weeks, the one who listens when I talk about my work, who asks thoughtful questions about the kids I'm trying to help, who cares about making a difference in the world, Is that the real you? Sarah considered the question carefully. It's the person I want to be. When I was running Meridian, I got so caught up in quarterly reports and board meetings and stock prices that I forgot why I started the company in the first place. My father built that business to provide good jobs for people in our community, to create products that made life better. Somewhere along the way, it became about growth for its own sake. And now I'm trying to figure out how to use what I've learned about myself to make choices that actually matter. The company is in trouble, and I have the power to help, but I don't want to go back to being the person I was before. Marcus nodded slowly. What if you didn't have to choose between being yourself and using your abilities to help others? What? Do you mean? What if there was a way to be both? To be the authentic person you've discovered you are, while also using your resources and experience to make a positive impact. Sarah felt a spark of possibility ignite in her chest. I've been thinking about that too. There are ways to restructure the company to refocus on sustainable practices and employee welfare instead of just maximizing profits. It would mean giving up some control and accepting lower returns, but it might be a way to honor both my father's original vision and the person I want to be now. That sounds like the kind of challenge someone with your skills and resources could tackle, Marcus said with a small smile. They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead. Finally, Sarah found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her heart. Marcus, where does this leave us? I know I hurt you by not being honest, and I understand if you can't trust me after that. Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah began to fear the worst. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but serious. I care about you, Sarah. I care about the woman who worries about other people's problems, who asks about my work because she genuinely wants to understand, who makes me laugh and challenges me to think differently about the world. The fact that you have money doesn't change any of that. Relief flooded through her, but she could hear a but coming. But I need to know that you trust me enough to be honest going forward. Relationships can't survive without trust, and I need to believe that you see me as someone safe enough to be real with. You are, Sarah said immediately. Marcus, you're the safest person I've ever known. What scares me isn't that you'll hurt me or use me. What scares me is that I'll disappoint you, that I'll make choices that let you down or become someone you can't respect. Marcus reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. Sarah, I work with kids who've made mistakes, who've gotten into trouble, who sometimes make choices that disappoint the people who care about them. But that doesn't mean they're not worthy of love and support. Making mistakes doesn't disqualify you from being cared about. The simple truth of his words broke something open in Sarah's chest, and she began to cry in earnest for the first time in months. All the loneliness and fear and uncertainty she'd been carrying poured out in tears that felt both devastating and cleansing. Marcus moved closer on the bench and wrapped his arms around her, holding her while she cried out years of accumulated hurt and isolation. When the tears finally subsided, she found herself curled against his chest, feeling safer than she had in longer than she could remember. I love you, she whispered into the fabric of his sweater, the words slipping out before she could stop. Then she felt his arms tighten around her. I love you too, he said quietly. Not your money, not your success, not what you can do for other people. I love you. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the boardroom of Meridian Industries, addressing her leadership team about the new direction the company would be taking. She'd returned as CEO, but with a completely restructured approach that prioritized employee welfare, environmental sustainability, and community impact alongside profitability. It hadn't been easy. Some board members had resigned rather than accept the new vision, and shareholders had initially balked at projections showing lower short-term returns. But gradually, as the company's reputation improved and employee satisfaction scores soared, even the skeptics began to see the wisdom in building a business that could sustain itself for generations rather than burning bright and fast. After the meeting, Sarah walked to the window of her office and looked down at the street 42 floors below. Corner Brew was too far away to see from here, but she knew that in a few hours, she'd be meeting Marcus there for their daily coffee date. Some things had changed dramatically in her life, but that simple ritual remained constant. Her assistant buzzed in to let her know that the proposal for the Meridian Foundation had been approved by the board. The foundation would focus on supporting children in foster care, providing resources for education, mental health services, and assistance with the transition to independence. Marcus had helped design the program, and he'd agreed to leave his current position to serve as the foundation's director. Sarah smiled as she thought about the conversation they'd had the night before, sitting in her penthouse apartment that Marcus now shared with her. He'd been nervous about taking the job, worried that people might think he was benefiting from their relationship rather than earning the position on his merit. "You're the most qualified person I know for this work," she'd told him. "You understand these kids because you've been where they are. You know what they need because you needed it yourself. The fact that I love you doesn't make you less qualified. It makes me lucky enough to work with the person who's best suited for the job." Now, looking out at the city where she'd built her empire and then dismantled her isolation, Sarah felt a contentment she'd never experienced in her previous life. She had work that mattered, a relationship built on trust and genuine affection, and a sense of purpose that went beyond quarterly earnings reports. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Board meeting go well? Looking forward to hearing about it over coffee. Love you." Sarah typed back, "It went perfectly. See you at our table in an hour. Love you too." As she gathered her things to leave the office, Sarah thought about that morning 6 months ago when her card had been declined and a stranger had stepped forward to help. She'd been testing whether anyone could care about her without knowing her worth, but Marcus had been demonstrating something far more profound. He'd shown her that kindness didn't require calculation, that human connection could exist without transaction, and that love was possible even when you had nothing to offer except yourself. The coffee that morning had cost $4.50. The lesson it taught her about the difference between being valued and being valuable was beyond price. And the man who'd bought it for her had become the most important person in her world, not because of what he could give her, but because of who he helped her remember she could be. Walking out of the building that evening, Sarah Williams felt truly wealthy for the first time in her life.